Just a quick question, who here is making games actively at the moment? That's awesome. That's shit hot, actually. How many of you are coders, artists, designers, sound people? Anybody I forgot? Any discipline I've completely insulted by Sorry? Producers, yes. Any producers? Awesome. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Defiant. Defiant's a 25-person studio based in Brisbane. We've been running for the last 7 years, making games of a variety of types. We initially set up with the goal of just doing a something. We thought maybe we might become an architectural visualization firm, but we were all ex-game developers, and it turned out that we made augmented reality architectural visualizations, and then they turned into augmented reality games, and before we knew it, we were a games company. And that's worked out pretty well for us over the years. We've had a number of titles that we've released and worked on. We were entirely bootstrapped in terms of our funding. We started with just Dan and I working and supported by our wives, and over time we built that up, raised, got projects underway, got other people working with us, and have built the studio from there. We had a few mobile titles of varying success. Rocket Bunnies and Ski Safari are the two most notable of those. We then built Hand of Fate, which is a PC, console, Mac, Linux, probably other platforms I'm forgetting, title that's done very well for us in that space. And we're now hard at work on Hand of Fate 2, which will be out sometime in the next 6 months. It should have been out in February, but it wasn't finished, so it's not. But that's the date we were aiming for. So that's kind of a quick rundown on what Defiant is and where Defiant is today. I did want to touch on kind of how I got into the industry. Sorry, I'll try and stop making this make wobbly sounds. So, as I said, I got into the industry 17 years ago, and one of the most common questions I get generally when I'm talking about kind of game development and my life in games is people asking, how did you get in? And I'm going to tell the story because there's some interesting things along the way, but I want to make very clear that that's a path that happened 17 years ago, which, given that we're all in a tech-adjacent industry, is the same as like the 1600s. Effectively, I rode a horse-drawn cart to school, and it's not an attempt to say this is a relevant path for anybody else or this is what you should do. But I started way back when. Actually, the real way that I started in games is I grew up in a very gaming family. My grandmother taught me to play Mahjong. I was the fourth hand in my mother's 500 games at a very early age. And then at some point I got a Dick Smith VZ200 computer with rubber keys and started building stuff on that. But really where all of that came through into the professional side is a good friend of mine was a fabulous artist that I used to run the D&D campaigns for at high school. He went on to get a job at Irrational Games, and he called me up to say, you should come and apply. I'd been doing a lot of stuff in the role-playing space, in pen and paper and tabletop games, a lot of writing. He's like, I think that's what a designer does. You should come and be a game designer. And at the time, I was actually busy running another terrible business that crashed and burned because I had no idea how to run a business. But hadn't quite crashed and burned enough at that point for me to walk away from it. So I said no. A year later, it turned out the person they'd hired hadn't worked out. I had managed to successfully sink the terrible business that I was trying to run with no idea of what I was doing. For reference here, that was the first .com boom and then crash. And what we were trying to run was a company called Netizen, which was kind of a Pearl consulting company, basically. But it was run entirely by people whose only knowledge of business was reading microserfs and Usenet posts. And this did not suffice in any way, shape or form. We had great beanbags, terrible business sense. So that ran for a while, ran its natural course. And I looked up Anthony, who was my mate at Irrational. He said, the timing is good. The other designers left, come on board. And I really cut my teeth at Irrational. And one thing I'm going to kind of touch base on is there's a lot of different ways to make games. Anything that I say that seems like a kind of rule of thumb for how to make games is just nonsense. There's a whole bunch of different ways. They all work out. Like the only thing I would say is that there's a lot more ways not to make games than there are to make games. And if you're the best way to learn about it is to look around you and see what other people are doing. So it's always a productive process to learn more. It's never a productive process to mimic somebody else's process and kind of jump straight in line. So at Irrational, the way they make games is what I kind of call a kitchen sink approach. They're very simulation focused, they're very systems driven. The game we were making there was Freedom Force. The first roots of the Lost were happening in the Boston office at that point in time, which was sort of the game that went on to become BioShock. And the team in Australia also did SWAT and a bunch of other titles along the way. So when I talk about these games as being systemic, you've got a physics system, you've got role-playing systems, you're tying all of these things together, you've got a whole bunch of stats, a whole bunch of things. And the interesting thing about all of this from a game development perspective is it's a terrifying way to make games, particularly if you're new to making games, as I was at the time. And it's a terrifying way to make games because nothing you're building really looks like a game. Like it's a string of parts. And there's not if you go and make games at a big company like an Ubisoft or an EA, one of the first things you'll have to do is provide some sort of vertical slice. And a team might spend 6 months to a year working on a vertical slice, but nonetheless the vertical slice is a piece of the game that looks like the shipping game. That's the goal anyway. So it's like 10 minutes you can play that's 10 minutes as it will be in the final game, and that's generally where games get greenlit or cancelled inside big studios. Irrational at that time did not work anything like that. There were 10 minutes of the shipping game that were playable and fun at exactly the same time as we shipped the game, and not one moment before, because the game was ready to ship at exactly the moment that it became fun and not before. So like I say, this is a kind of terrifying seat of your pants way to make games when you haven't made games before. You look around at what everybody else is doing, every individual task seems to make sense. Like, the things you're building are parts of a game. But looking at Freedom Force at that point, you're like, the thing that we've actually built is not a game. It takes a while to compile, it takes a lot of time to do work, we've got levels, we've got content, but combat's not fun, none of these pieces are fun, none of these pieces really come together. Fortunately, we had a couple of... And I will also point out that this team, the Australian Irrational team, had been built from scratch and was mostly made of people who had maybe 3 or 4 years' experience. For the vast majority of the team was people in their mid-20s or younger with not a ton of experience. And there were about 15 or 20 of us, but we were fortunate enough to be working with John Che, who was running the Australian studio, who was a veteran of the American Irrational, and with direct input from Ken Levine and the rest of the Irrational crew to keep us on course. Which is fortunate, because when you would panic and say things like, the combat's not fun, the whole game's not fun, the game's predicated on combat, what if we just make a bunch of stealth missions? Because maybe we can make stealth fun. There are people who say, look, you should, when you build your missions, you should lean on the game's combat, because that's one of the core systems. And you say, but it's not fun, so I'll make some different stuff. And they say, well, if combat's not fun, the other 94% of the game that relies on combat will be rubbish and we're shipping a turd. So don't worry about that. Just rely that it will be fun one day, and and you'll end up in a much better, because if it's not, we're all screwed. So just assume we're going to get there. Just assume we're going to get there is a common catch cry in game development as we work today as a team. The fortunate thing is that at Defiant, the team's been together for long enough that we all have confidence in what each other can do. I certainly find it a lot less scary with the benefit of hindsight. We also do a bit more planning than they did at Irrational. After Irrational and after shipping Freedom Force, which came out, did really well, was finished, was good, to get there required 6 months of us being in, no, it's literally shipping tomorrow, kind of panic, and then it didn't ship, and we were like, oh well, we've got 2 more weeks. We've got 2 more weeks to fix everything that's broken. Still didn't ship. And what I didn't realise at that point in time was that these pushes were part of getting the team to focus on getting the game done, but it was also part of Ken and John being conscious of the fact that the game wasn't good enough yet. Getting a game to a quality bar that you're happy to put out is really important. From there, I went to Relic in Vancouver. I spent a bunch of time at Relic, and I worked on Homeworld there, as well as some early Dawn of War work. Relic was really eye-opening and a very interesting place to work, because they were the exact opposite way around. Having shipped a game that had kind of come together from a pretty good production process and plan, the work we were doing on Homeworld was very focused. The game, there was an engine in place, there was a game in place, there were mechanics, there was a structure, and the overall super skeleton of how everything went together was defined. It helped that we were working in a defined genre, although in a slightly different fashion, because RTSs existed and tech trees existed, and you could say that, to build an RTS you probably need one each of these things from the feature list of what makes up an RTS. But it was a much more organised way of going about things, and it all sprang from a roughly 20-page design doc that was locked in quite early. And that design doc design docs, I think, are an important part of development if you're working with other people and you have to clearly explain your ideas. At Defiant, we prefer a slightly more free-form approach. Generally, our games are grown organically over the process. They don't look a lot like their starting launch-off point, but we still spend some time defining them early on. But I think if you're going to make design docs, there's a temptation for designers, and I am a designer and writer first for my various sins. And the thing is, if you're a writer, the temptation is to write, and you can write a lot, and you can write a lot of rot, and I don't recommend it. The game needs to be the ultimate arbiter of the game itself. Design docs are great at pointing the direction and setting up the intent, but as I say, I think 20 pages for a commercial game is a pretty good amount of space to spend on a design doc. It's enough time to highlight all the features, talk about how they work together, give some details to the scope, remove the key ambiguity for the team about what exactly it is the game that you're making, and then anything else can be addressed in a specific brief that's written around a specific function if you need to. As I say, we don't do a lot of writing up briefs at Defiant now. We have had the luxury over the last 2 years of working on a sequel. Sequels are really easy. I mean, they're not, because we've still managed to take 2.5 years to get this one to shipping, even though the first one was done start to finish in 2 years. And in theory, we should know what we're doing, but we still couldn't scope it or hit a date. But relatively speaking, sequels, particularly when you're putting something together new in a gameplay sense, are a lot easier because you have a sense of what your game is, what it's not, how it fits together, how all those bits go. After Relic, I went to Ubisoft, and there I learned a little bit about making games with 300 plus people on a team. I did some work on Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. I didn't do a lot of work at Ubisoft because I learned really quickly that I don't work very well in a big 300-person team, and that's due to my terrible personality and my unwillingness to be a cog in the big machine, even a relatively senior cog as I was. That said, there are a lot of people who fit really well in those environments. I've got great friends at big studios, and one of the biggest things we're missing in Australia at the moment, I think, is big studios. Big studios are great for providing people with experience and giving them an opportunity to see a whole bunch of different aspects of development in a relatively safe fashion. Which leads me to Pandemic Australia, where I came, spent 2 years, didn't ship any games because the studio got bought by EA and then shut down. But I worked with a bunch of great people, and again, on EA's massive and not very well applied budget, they let us get some experience inside that organisation, running teams, putting things together. I'd been a lead designer for a while there, but I was working with some fabulous other leads. Dan Treble, who's now the tech director and co-founder at Defiant, and Sean Eustace, who's our art director. So we all got a chance to work as a 20-person team, building a project, putting that together. And then when they shut down the other project that was running in the studio, we got to run a 60-person team for a while. And build up relationships in kind of a large kind of AAA studio environment. I will say that in general, if you have the option to sell to an enormous multinational, I reckon don't, because they're really bad at running studios they've purchased. Like, there's a fantastic history of studios that have been purchased by big publicly listed companies, and very, very few of them have successfully gone on to run good businesses. That's not to say some don't survive. BioWare, which was bought at the same time as Pandemic by EA, went on to quite successfully kind of operate a reverse takeover and infest some of EA's business department, and are still successfully making great games. There are other studios that have managed the same, but in general, big publicly traded companies with quarterly earnings reports tend to do things like look at a strong Australian dollar and try and move their businesses to cheaper cost centres, which is what's happening at the moment. And my take is that games ultimately is a hit-driven industry, which means that you don't have to worry. We're not a margins-based industry. Like, no game studio should be sitting there and looking at the way that they're going to save 10 cents. We share a building now at Defiant. We share the building with an architecture firm, PDT. Watching the way they work is really eye-opening, because they are a margins-based business. They get a set amount to build a building, and then they have to work out how to allocate every cent. If they use the thick 3-ply toilet paper, then they're sitting there going, well, that's $80 per head per month off our bottom line, and that's less that we make at the end of the line, which is a freaking stupid way to run a game studio. And don't get me wrong, like, game studios will often fail to make any money at all, which makes all of this academic. There's lots of ways to make no money in games, but as I say, we're a hit-driven industry, and that means we don't make a game that makes a 10% profit on what we invested in it. We either make a hit or we miss. And when I say hit, I'm not saying Call of Duty. The chances of any of us having $1 billion opening week are very low in the indie space. But I mean that there's always a spectrum of games that you're in, and there are games that do better or worse. The games that do worse probably make a lot less than they cost to make. So it was not uncommon when we were in the mobile space. A big part of the reason we got out of the mobile space is because we were watching good games, good mobile titles launch out and make about $50,000, and they would be games that two to four people had invested a year or two in, and you look at that and you go, that's only just break even, if not a decent loss on people's time and energy. So we moved away because it seemed like a business where good content was failing to make money. But nonetheless, you could still look at the hits. You still look at, and I'm, again, not even talking about crossy road hits, just talking about medium level hits that would make $400,000 or $500,000 on maybe $100,000 or $200,000 investment. It's not important to save the $80 on toilet paper. It's important to do everything you can to try and make a hit, which means understanding the market you're going into, understanding what people want, and understanding what it is that's important for you to make. And again, let me say, I have no qualms whatsoever if what you're making is art house, individual expressions of your own inner truth for your audiences. I 100% support that. We have a fabulous games art house movement that's kind of happening at the moment. There's a ton of really good games from that perspective. If you do it, I recommend doing it as passionately and enthusiastically as you can, working out how you're going to support yourself while you do that, and absolutely putting your focus on doing that as well as you possibly can. Do not do that to make money. That's making the thing that only you can creatively express as a means to making money is bad for a couple of reasons. One, it's bad because those things really rarely make money. They do make money. I can point to a bunch of examples of games like Journey or Dear Esther or Jason Rohrer games. I can point to games that are expressions of what people want to say that have made money, but the vast majority of the time they don't. The other reason not to do it is because I think if you are trying to make passionate art that comes directly from your heart and expresses the truth that only you can express, commercialising that is shithouse. Like, the worst thing you can do when you're trying to be honest and bare your soul is to be like, I wonder what somebody would pay for this. It's a terrible way to pursue those goals. Now, as I say, so if you're making that, ignore everything I say about business. On the other side of the coin, what I think is most indie devs who would who are passionately driven to make games, have the ability to make games, have things they want to say, and would like to be able to pay their rent. And that's the sort of studio that we built. To do that, you need to take some commercial elements into consideration. And the way we do that at Defiant is Defiant has been always built from day one to build games that kind of exist in the centre of the Venn diagram of three things. And those three things are games we want to make, and if you're a creative person, I'm sure you have a notebook full of ideas on games you want to build and things you'd like to make. So for us, there's a big list of games we'd like to make. There's games that I have no interest in making whatsoever. There's games that the rest of the team are super excited about. There's things that individuals on the team are excited about. We always try and look at what everybody on the studio is into and work out, kind of what that represents. You're not trying to make a game that appeals to everybody, but you're trying to make a game that everybody can have a stake in and feel good about. So that's one aspect. The next aspect over is kind of what games can we build? We have 25 people, we can do a lot of stuff, but we clearly can't make a Call of Duty competitor. So we've got to look at scope and potential. We have limited amounts of time. We could work for the next 8 years on a game. No, we couldn't. We'd go broke. If we continue to sell like an inordinate amount of copies, like if somebody suddenly decides to buy 1 million copies of Hand of Fate, we could make games for 8 years. But regardless, 8 years is a bad timeline for us. We try and scope things down. Ideally, we're looking at 18 months to 2 years. That seems to have, when we started Defiant, that was 3 to 6 months. As the team's grown, that's become more like 2.5 years. Maybe it's 3 years now. I'd like to do it faster so that we can have a more stable idea of what the business environment is that we're headed into, but it is what it is. But games we can make, games we have the skills for, games that utilise the skills of the team. Like, we have a bunch of awesome 3D artists and environment modelers. I can make a pitch for a 2D side-scrolling platformer, but if we make that game, we have to fire half the staff. So that's not a good choice. So games we can make. And finally, games somebody wants to buy. Like, that's the third piece. And you never start there. You never start by looking at the market and saying, what do people want to buy? Let's try and make something that panders to those desires. I mean, you can. Like, God knows there's a lot of business that's built around exactly that model. So it's clearly a viable model. But from our perspective, we look for the things we want to make that we are technically capable of making, that also somebody wants to buy, and that space in the middle is a lot smaller. And that space in the middle is kind of what focuses us as a studio. The way ideas are developed at Defiant is effectively through repetition. Everybody in the team has tons of ideas. We talk about stuff regularly. We start projects, we kill projects, and the way that we know to kind of start working on a project in earnest is when people have been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. You know, if it's a pitch that somebody makes on Monday and that's forgotten by Friday, which is very common of the things I say, I probably have an idea a day that I speak with Dan, who's the other founder at Defiant, about, and that Dan, you know, nods and grins, and then we never speak of again because it's terrible, and that goes on. But if sometimes there are ideas that stick, and you're like, no, that is interesting, that is something, and we kind of ball those up as we go. But the other thing we do is cancel a lot of projects. So we'll often start, stop, get some way down the line, cut a project, and while these are kind of applicable ways to go about it for a 25-person studio, I actually think they're applicable to 1 or 2 person indies as well. It's the same process. You've got to start looking at things that you think can have a space in the market, and to briefly touch on marketing too, just as I go there was a chat that we were having earlier. The key to marketing a game, the key to marketing a game is to have a game that people want to talk about. You know, I often speak to indies who've got a game to a certain point, they've put it in the market and it hasn't sold, and they'll bemoan that there was a lack of marketing around that. Marketing's not magic. Like, marketing's not a magic thing that you sprinkle on at the end and then all of a sudden people are interested in your game. Marketing is just amplifying the story that your game has, and there has to be a reason that people want to play your game. There has to be something that people look at. You can execute as fabulously as you please, but if people don't get there, then nobody sees that. Nobody knows that you did a fantastic job of building an, immaculately crafted experience. If you're really lucky, then your game can find a hero that carries it around. I think streamers have been responsible for surfacing a bunch of different games that probably wouldn't have found audiences without games. But ultimately it comes down to what's the story of that game, and how does the game express that story through the things that people see. The first elements that people are going to see of your game are the store page. They're the screenshots, they're the icon, they're the description, they're the name. All of those things, you have a very, very limited amount of bandwidth to tell people it's something that they want and it's something that they want to love. There's a million books on marketing, and I recommend reading at least 2 of them. 2's really good for anything like this. If you read one book on marketing, you just think everything in it is right. If you read 2, you realise that most of the things in the second one contradict the first one. So you have like enough bits to put together binocular vision at that point in time, and start to come up with your own ideas. But at least you understand at that point the basics and the fundamentals. As I say, it's important that your game have a story that people want to tell. That's a key part of it finding its audience. And that story that people want to tell has to be something that's interesting. Like, again, coming at this from a writer's perspective, we so often we're interested in what we write because we wrote it. Like, I can tell you pages and pages of backstory for Hand of Fate. I can tell you the reasons people turned up there, why there is this deal, or all of that sort of stuff. What he ate for breakfast yesterday. Like, I know this because I've written it down, but I haven't written it down for anybody else. I've written it down for me because the process of writing is a process of ordering thoughts. All of that turns into 4 lines at the start of the game that set up the premise for the game, and that's the important part. That's the surface that's applied to the player. It's important to consider story from the perspective of why that's going to be interesting to somebody to tell what's in your audience. And you can practice this. You can practice telling people the story about your game. And I don't mean the story of your game, I mean the story about your game. And seeing whether their eyes glaze over and whether they stop caring. And you've basically got to keep telling it until people are actually engaged and interested. If you're not sure whether people are actually engaged and interested, then I don't know what to tell you. You need to spend more time listening, watching other people. But yeah, you really want to be testing out these stories around your game. I thought I'd talk a little bit about how people work at Defiant, because it's a nice kind of boundary between indies, small 1 or 2 person indie teams. The answer of kind of what you do on the game is everything. Sometimes you only do half of everything if there's another person, but fundamentally anything that relates to getting that game done is the thing that ends up on your plate. I've been fortunate enough to have quite a few conversations with small 1 or 2 person indie developers who've made lots of money on either the App Store or Steam, and then talk to them about the problems they face. The problems they face is that all of that other stuff that's not making a game becomes an overwhelming responsibility once you've got a successful game. You will get, if you've got a mildly successful game on the App Store, you will hear from 100 ad agencies every day. You'll have 100 different people making you offers, making business suggestions about things you could do. There's opportunities, there's new stores to go on, there's weird Chinese consoles that say, they want to pay you money so that they can release their game on their Android micro console. All of that is time consuming and difficult. But the fortunate thing is, before you've had a successful title launched, you can actually focus mainly on the act of making the game. The difference at a big AAA studio is, I sat next to, at Ubisoft, I sat next to the person who did the street lights and fire hydrants for a open world game. And that was their job for 2 years. I had another really good friend who was responsible for the female lead in Prince of Persia, again for 2.5 years. That was a character modeler, an artist who effectively built that character, iterated over that character, dealt with feedback, maybe did a few other tiny bits of the game, but really at the big AAA end you end up with one thing that you're looking after, whether it's a system or a piece of content or a type of content. And that's what you do. And the good thing is that you end up with a pretty clear idea of what your roles and responsibilities are. You will come in at the start of a month and have a list of a month's worth of work, and you will deliver a month's worth of work and it will get put into the game. At Defiant, we sort of sit in the middle in that we have individuals in charge of areas of responsibility. So on the art side, we have one character modeler who models all of the characters in our game, one environment artist who's responsible for all of the environments in our game. We actually have a card artist who's our kind of only super specialist. Jesse Gillespie is also one of our only contractors. He lives in a cabin in the US. He draws all of these by hand, and then he scans them in and sends them over to us, and that's what he does. We have an art director who's responsible for everything in the art team. We have a particle artist who's responsible for all of the whiz-bang special effects, these sorts of lovely roaring fires and so forth. We have a couple of animators. We had 3 animators until very recently, who are responsible for both rigging and animation of all the characters in the game, the dealer, all the enemy characters. On the design side, it works a little differently. The design team is a pool and works much like a writer's room would on a TV series, in that everybody's there, everybody's part of the creative process, everybody has input, and then they're responsible for building content in the game, writing cards, building challenges. Each person will own whatever piece of content they happen to be working on, but broadly speaking, that's a collaborative team. And the programming team under Dan very much across every aspect of the game. So every one of our coders is capable of doing, working on any part of our game. The game's built in Unity. We've built a lot of custom code on top of that. It's true that different people have different areas of focus. We've had people who have had a lot more to do with the combat side of things than others. We've had people who've been mostly responsible for building the UI, seen all of the UI in Hand of Fate is 3D objects, cards moving around and selection. It's an incredible pain in the arse. We've made our lives much more difficult than we would have had we used a simpler and more boring UI. But nonetheless, that all pulls together. And then there's myself, who works on kind of organising the design team, Sean, the art director, who works on organising the art team, Dan, our tech director, who works on organising the coding team. We have Kim, who's our producer, and Lee, who's our marketing manager. And across the kind of creative direction, art direction, and tech direction team, along with the producer, our job is to make sure that everybody has clear blocks of tasks and that they know how those tasks fit into the big picture and will deliver the ultimate game. So we also have Emma, who works in the art department, who works on everything like these maps and various elements. But as I say, basically our job is to make sure that people have a clear idea of what they're doing, how that fits into the big picture, how that's going to make the game. We use a Scrumish system. We've done a more formal kind of type of Scrum development in the past, but now it's become a much more flexible and ad hoc system, which is to say we do stand-ups every morning to talk about what we've got on the slate, and we work to a 2-week rhythm. So we make sure people know what their tasks are for the next 2 weeks. We spend the time making sure that those tasks are organised for the 2 weeks coming after. But that in itself is pretty ad hoc. Again, working on sequels is easier than many other things because we know what pieces of the game are, we know which things we're changing, which things are staying the same. So a lot of our team are responsible for providing us the information about the tasks that need doing, that then become the next block of tasks. When we hire staff, the really important thing for us is that people are focused on communication. We're a collaborative studio, and again, when it comes to teams, I think if you're going to build a team, whether it's just 1 or 2 people or whether you're looking to build something bigger, it's really important to know what you are looking for in terms of people who would be part of that team, how you want to work. And that process is kind of twofold. You need to know what would make somebody a really good fit for your team, and also what would make somebody a terrible fit for your team. And people being a terrible fit for your team, like there are a lot of people who aren't great fits for the way we work. As I say, we place a huge focus on communication and collaboration. And the other thing that's really important to us is autonomy and a willingness to own your work. So you've got to be responsible for good work ending up in the game. You've got to talk to other people about it, and you've got to drive the ball forward when things need to get done. That works really well because we don't have a lot of superstructure, we don't have a lot of layers of management. We expect people to get stuff done. It doesn't work as well in other studios, and that's not a judgment against anybody. One of our best designers worked at another studio, worked with us at Pandemic, where they were a fantastic, A-class designer. Pandemic shut down, they went to work at another studio, THQ, and I think were nearly let go from THQ because they were underperforming and they were the worst designer in the studio, and now works for us and is awesome. And that's not because they, took a year off to be shithouse. That's just because there's a fit with every group. Finding, if you're going to make games with somebody else, if you're going to have a business partner and an indie partner and you're planning on making a game that might be 6 months or 12 months, like that's a really serious relationship. In my case, my relationship with Dan, who's my business partner, is a more serious relationship than I have with anybody other than my wife. My children have not had a relationship with me as long as Dan has, so I do like them better. But I like Dan a lot. And, we were fortunate enough to have the experience of working together at Pandemic to realise that we could work well together and that we could relate well together and we could get things done. So I cannot stress enough that if you want to make a game with somebody, the other thing to keep in mind is that before your game has made $1 million is the best time to have all the arguments, because after is really messy. And it's not that you should spend a ton of time putting contracts in place. Lawyers are expensive. If you're an indie dev like you were when we were an indie dev and set up, you don't have any money to spend on lawyers. None of this needs to be complicated. You just need to have the conversations. You need to have the painful conversations with your partner about, what would we do? What do we do if one of us decides that this game is shithouse and they don't want to work on it anymore? Like, do we still own half each? Or, so does one person work away, one person finishes it, and then the person who walked away owns half of it? Probably not. But the exact balance and how you want to do that is a thing that's really important to work out. I've seen more companies fall apart because of a lack of preparation and a lack of talking honestly about, what it is to build a business together than I would like. And as I say, it becomes particularly bad when there's a bit of success around and there's a sniff of success. In your ideal situation of making games, you should be using that success to roll into further success. But if that's all tied up in everybody being unhappy and wanting to take their pieces and go home, that's less easy. So I think it's important that you know why you're making what you're making. Like, the reason we built a studio was to make good games. The games we make, we have our own definition of good, we have our own things. But the games we make, we try and make games that wouldn't exist if we didn't make them. And we try and make games that appeal to the sorts of very geeky people that we are in the studio. But most of all, we try and make games that let us express a little bit of ourselves through the game. And that goes for kind of every member of the team. There's expressiveness in what we do. And I'd like to think that all the lessons that we've learned from making games through our careers pop up in bits and pieces of the games we make. They're only like tip of the iceberg things, but those are the foundations on which we've built the studio. And I could drill down into a long list of specific things that have their presence there. A good example is I wrote all of the AI dialogue for Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. And if anybody's played a Splinter Cell game, you know that most of the AI dialogue consists of, did I just hear Sam Fisher? I think I heard Sam Fisher. Did you see something over there? Was it a Sam Fisher? Is there a Sam Fisher over there? Like, it's all variations on that. And it doesn't matter how many times you write it. And you have to write it for like every enemy type. And the enemy types are like naive guard all the way through to very experienced guard. If you've ever tried to write, did you hear that? Like, as differentiated between somebody with expertise and somebody with no skill whatsoever, it's really tough because like the thing that the player needs to have is clear feedback about what they just did. So they need to know they made a sound. So you can't deviate very far from, did you hear that, says I, expert man. And in doing that, in writing those thousands and thousands of lines, what I realised is you're still going to hear the same thing over and over again because it's a really limited set of lines that apply to the one person who you're trying to creep around from. and there's a really limited set of conditions in which you hear those lines. So no matter how many times how many variations you write, the player does those actions thousands of times in the course of a gameplay session, and then they do it thousands more times. So it becomes tedious by definition. With Hand of Fate, what I really wanted to do was make one character who sounded alive, who never repeated himself, who had something interesting to say about every single thing you could do. And if he didn't have anything interesting to say, would shut his goddamn mouth. And that's what we did. And that's one of the things that's been received really well. And it really, as I say, it comes out of that desire to take "Did you hear something?" and turn it into something more personal. Take it away from being a bit of gameplay you need to know about. Like if you need to block, we have green things that pop up over your head that tell you that you have to block. That's a gameplay mechanic. The things the dealer speaks about are not mechanical, they're narrative. He gets to tell you the story of the world, the story of the reasons he's there, and reveal those little bits poking through the game. So it's fundamental if you're making something to know why, to know what it is that you're trying to do, to know how you're going to tell that story to other people, to know why anybody else would care about this thing you've made, to know how you structured it, to know how your team's going together, even if that team's just you and one other person, to know how you're going to work together, to know what the agreement is, to have all of these things planned out before. None of these are rocket science. They just need a little bit of effort. And all of that effort that I've talked about, that's effort that's not writing code or making a game asset. You know, of all the things I've talked about tonight, you know, writing code and making a game asset is the bit that comes after. And don't get me wrong, it's fundamental and it's important. And the only way that we develop our craft skills is by using them. Like the only way that you're going to become good at making games that people want to play is by making games that people want to play. But the fundamentals come first in the reasons why and the reasons that will be important to somebody else. So fundamentally, I encourage you all to go build things and to think about why they're valuable. This is my trigger that I've gone on long enough, and I really appreciate your coming out. I think, you know, in the theme of building things, it's great to see a fantastic community building here. You're in a great location. You have some great people around, and I look forward to meeting the rest of you gang. If you're down in Brisbane, feel free to look us up. I have brought no business cards, but I'm very easy to find. We are defiantdev.com. I'm Morgan at defiantdev.com, or Morgan Jaffit on Twitter and Facebook and email and all of those sorts of things. But look us up. Always happy to grab a coffee and show you the studio if you're down that neck of the woods. Thank you very much for coming along.